Let's just talk a little bit about what the benchmarks would be if a company was coming to you and saying, what are the benchmarks? How do we operate on the African continent?
Thank you very much. I think the first starting point would be, obviously, in terms of companies understanding the basics of governance, would be the statute, the law relevant to a particular country. After that, then it is issues such as the King's 3 report on corporate governance, in order to help organizations to understand the basic principles that they should be adhering to in terms of what is good corporate governance. And it's pretty well known that that particular report, i.e. the King's 3 report, has become internationally accepted as one of the best practices recommendations in terms of governance.
When it comes to doing, I mean, one of the things I would like us to talk about is just the BRICS countries, because those have come under the spotlight just in terms of the corruption in those countries. And there's been quite a bit of if you can call it, condemnation to the way they have been tackling, corruption in those countries. I would just like to talk about the African continent in particular, because sometimes there is this perception of, if you're doing business in Africa, then you've got to pay bribes. It comes with the territory. Is that perception one that is actually reality?
I think in many respects, it's still the norm. It's interesting that we see, for example, the Codex, a particular recommendation from Germany that actually speaks in 2002 about no longer being able to write off your bribery against tax payments. And that's rather interesting, because one questions whether or not companies are still practicing bribery and corruption, notwithstanding a very good recommendation coming from Germany. If you have a look at all the international reports, particularly the ones of late, the Bribery Pays Index, the Transparency Index, there are a number of them, the Competitive Rating Report, the Anti-Competitive Reports. From a South African point of view, regrettably we're down on all of them. And I think there's something to be said about that. This is the perceptions of how the world sees South Africa and, of course, the African continent. So what do they say? If there's a spark, there's a fire, and there's a fire, there's a flame. So there's got to be some truth in terms of what we see happening in terms of our down-rated ratings in all of these reports in South Africa still today as we speak, and still relative to many of the BRIC countries as well.
Let's just talk about the BRIC countries, because a country like Brazil, one of the things that has been said particularly about Brazil is that people would like to see in that country a different culture, and that different culture being that if you find a person that is corrupt in government, for instance, then don't just fire that person. They have to be criminally charged, and they, consequently, if they're found guilty, must be thrown in jail. And I think that would be something that would be said not only of Brazil, but that might be a sentiment that you might find in other countries as well.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. Interestingly, in South Africa, we've just opened up through the Presidency's office the Corruption Watch, and I think that's indeed what we're trying to achieve in South Africa. So there is a greater emphasis placed on doing good business and business the right way. So yes, I would agree. I mean, we've got to go that route. Whether or not it's happening or not is another question altogether, as is evident in the earlier reports I referred to, because our ratings are still not looking very good. I think in terms of reports such as the King report, there we certainly are talking about the ethical practices and how the business needs to be conducted. And it's certainly not in general being done that way, because in many instances there's quite a lot of lip service, things that we would like to do but don't have the necessary people doing it. So the leadership perhaps in the political will is maybe not as good as what we'd like to see it.
When you talk about political will, what is actually interesting to me is sometimes when I read some of these reports, some of the businesses that are going in and paying bribes are foreign businesses, and some of them are coming from developed countries, and they're going into a country and paying those bribes. Does that not continue to perpetuate this culture?
It certainly does, Hannah. And again, I don't have a specific answer to that. But I mean, if you have a look at what other countries are suggesting should be the case, you have to just go back to, for example, laws such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977, a US piece of legislation. And one would have thought that coming from the US, it would have a massive clout right throughout the world. And indeed, that was in 1977. Not much has changed, regrettably. Sadly, the UK Bribery Act just came out, I think, towards the end of 2002, 2010, and yet another piece of legislation from another country altogether. And yet we still today talk about bribery and corruption. I'm asking what really has changed since perhaps the advent of King 1, which was put onto the table in 1994. So you have all these wonderful recommendations coming through. And I think if the political will and the leadership is not right, we're going to continue writing these codes, these recommendations. And if the sentiment is, well, to get the job done in a BRIC type of environment, if that's still very much the order of the day, I think we can still see this going on for many years to come.
Talking about political will, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao has been quoted saying China could face a threat to its power structure unless it stamps out rampant corruption amongst officials. And that's China saying, well, we do have a problem, and our power as the government could be at threat if we don't sort this out. Just in terms of reality and getting into the ground and rooting out corruption, because it's easy to say, well, we need to root out corruption.
Sure.
Just talk about the intricacies of actually being able to achieve that you have that higher ranking when it comes to organizations like Transparency International.
I think at its most basic level, we have to understand that the duty that is owed to any organization or company is right from the top. The tone's got to be set from the top. And there's a wonderful book from a chap by the Professor Bob Garrett, who talks about the fish rotting from the head. And I think certainly if we have a look at the analogy of that, we need to understand that the political will has got to come from the top of a government that sets the structures. And that has to flow itself right the way through a particular country, that it runs from a presidency, the entire people that work at the presidency, right down to all types of corporations, right down to schools, universities, businesses, and indeed even at home. And if you're not getting that change taking place, then I think we're going to be in for a long run. This is just not going to sort itself out. And perhaps we might also find that the way in which we mete out the punishment when that is discovered is going to have to become a much harsher sanction compared to a slap on the wrists.
One of the things, we were interviewing somebody about just BRICS and they're coming together, and one of the things they said is they would like to see concrete measures come out of this and say these are the mechanisms we're going to use as BRICS. And so just on the back of that, there is a column that was suggesting that as the level of cooperation between the BRICS countries increases, they also need to be working towards working together as a BRICS body to be able to combat corruption, because they were saying if that doesn't happen, then who's to say that cross-border corruption is not going to happen between these countries?
Yeah. This is absolutely true, and I think if we talk about the supply chain once again, not just the international supply chain in which South Africa operates, but also the supply chain in terms of the people who are actually doing all the necessary functions at border control, right the way through, right onto business, exchanging goods, etc., etc. Everybody has to be on the same page, which brings me to the point that it's very difficult to regulate behavior. So, how much law do you have to put in place to making sure that all the systems are working? And it's a tough challenge. And I think this is where the spirit in South Africa of Ubuntu and partnership is really going to be tested to see whether or not the country really wants to become a truly global competitive player. And where the BRICS then come into this discussion, obviously, is that if you have a look at the type of GDP figures that we see taking place right now in China, in India, which is almost just below double-digit growth, South Africa is hoping to still achieve, if it's lucky, 2.6%. Now, the reason why that's coming down as much as what it is, in many instances, is because of the perceptions attached to crime, bribery, and corruption.